Nice to see everybody. I'm going to get us started right away. And I will just say at the outset, I think this has been a particularly grim week in American politics. And I'm going to concentrate on the events of this week. It's in a sense a segue into a lecture series I will begin with you next week, which will be on race and justice in American society. But given what's happened this week in American politics, I feel the need to really provide some analysis in addition to perhaps something of a warning in terms of what I see as some of the deep, worrisome trends in American politics right now. So on that note, let me jump right in. And as you will see, the title of today's lecture is Edging Towards a Dangerous Descent, the Erosion of Democratic Norms and Escalating Political Violence in Contemporary US Politics. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, but let me just provide some faces to the events of the last couple weeks. Starting with Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times by the police in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who has survived, thankfully, but will likely be paralyzed, and who was shot in front of his young children. This has prompted weeks of protests in Kenosha. And last week, a 17-year-old boy, young man, was driven from Illinois to Kenosha, apparently by his mother, with an assault rifle in his hands to join a militia, loose use of that term, who were there to protect businesses from looting, burning, rioting. And there has been violence in Kenosha. The protests have mainly been peaceful, but not entirely. And this 17-year-old boy found himself in a volatile situation and shot 3 people, killing 2 of them, including Anthony Huber, and just one of the people who he shot. I was able to find an image of him readily. So that's in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Then in Portland, Oregon, as many of us are aware, there have been protests going really for the entire summer since the killing of George Floyd, which started the most recent round of Black Lives Matter uprisings. And these protests have been particularly volatile because of the divide within Oregon, much of it geographic and political, between a rather radical left concentrated in Portland, and on the other hand, the population, especially to the right of the to the east of the Cascades, which tends to be politically pretty far to the right. And as you're well aware, last weekend, a convoy of Trump supporters drove into Portland, primarily in pickup trucks, many of them armed with at least paintball guns, pepper spray, mace, and confronted the protesters. And eventually, one of them was shot. That would be Aaron Danielson, by a man who was part of the protests, who was armed, who self-identifies as a member of Antifa, which is the label that some American far leftists use, referring to especially the Spanish anti-fascist movements. This man, Michael Forrest Reinl. And Reinl was shot and killed by federal agents who were attempting to apprehend him a few nights ago. And so we have had multiple political deaths in American politics in the last weak, right? And that's what I want to focus on today, and the danger that this represents. And so hence the seriousness and the gravity of today's talk. Um, I'm going to start by trying to put this in context, and I want to remind you of a book that we've looked at together. But before I do that, I just want to point out to you that this book, which is called How Democracies Die, which I'll be talking with you about in just a moment, I just grabbed a bunch of books off my bookcase and put them on my carpet this morning, as you can see, and they have titles like How Democracy Ends, How Democracy Dies, Counter Democracy, Against Democracy, Against Elections, If We Can Keep It, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved, Democracy in Chains, The People versus Democracy. There's a whole burgeoning political science literature on the fact that democracy right now, people refer to it as backsliding, deconsolidation, erosion, that there is less support for democracy in this beginning of the third decade of the 21st century than there has been for a long time, and that we should be concerned not only about the violence, but about the threat that it represents to democracy. So now going back to Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. I've spoken with you about this work before. It's a text written by two scholars of authoritarianism, and in particular, authoritarianism that arises within democracy. And they point out that the primary path to transitions away from democracy is not by external, but by internal threat. That typically it's an elected leader who attacks democracy and ultimately succeeds in overturning it. And for this reason, they put together indicators of authoritarian behavior by which we can judge political leaders. And they give us 4 main criteria and then sub-criteria by which to determine whether or not these criteria apply. Rejection of or a weak commitment to democratic rules of the game. Denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of violence, and readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Now, I will point out to you that in their book in 2018, they worried that Donald Trump showed more signs of authoritarian tendencies than did any president that they judged in the history of the United States. The other president who scored somewhat high on this scale was Richard Nixon, but Donald Trump scores much higher. And this is not something that Levitsky and Ziblatt have done. This is something that I have done. And I will say immediately, this is not political science. I'm not a big fan of the very idea of political science. When I came to Sarah Lawrence, one of the first things I did was to convince my colleagues to drop science from the title of our department. I don't think there is a political science, as opposed to, certainly not if by that we mean something that approximates the degree of certainty and rigor of the natural sciences. I don't think we need to borrow our prestige from the natural sciences. So this is not that kind of exercise. This is a kind of seat of the pants effort to say, if we were to look at Donald Trump using the scorecard of authoritarianism, how does he fare? And I just want to point out to you 2 things. The first is that on many of these criteria, I would give Donald Trump, on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being not at all authoritarian, 7 being highly authoritarian, a 7 on several criteria. For instance, do they, under the denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, do they baselessly describe their partisan rivals as criminals whose supposed violation of the law disqualifies them for full participation in the political arena? We saw this in 2016 with Lock Her Up. We saw this with the whole Ukraine affair that eventually led to Trump's impeachment, trying to frame Joe Biden as corrupt, right? And Trump understands that many Americans think that the political system is corrupt and has not responded to their needs. They think that for good reasons, because the political system hasn't responded to their needs. But he's trying to weaponize the alienation from politics, the suspicion that politicians are in it for their own good, against his opponents unilaterally. He's not enlisting that suspicion and the consequent alienation and anger that come with it for the purpose of democratic reform. He's using it exclusively for the purpose of partisan and personal advantage. So that's one place where I would suggest to you that Trump scores high. Another, do they claim that their rivals constitute an existential threat, either to national security or to the prevailing way of life? And again, Donald Trump has suggested that if Joe Biden is elected, we will enter a period of anarchy. He suggested if his measures on the border are not enacted, we won't have a country anymore. He repeatedly suggests that the American way of life is under attack, eroding, in the process of collapsing, and that his tough man tactics are necessary to save it. Similarly, toleration or encouragement of violence, this is where we're focusing today. Have they tacitly endorsed violence by their supporters by refusing to unambiguously condemn it and punish it? Remember that Donald Trump, in an interview on Monday night, referred to the convoy of his supporters that drove through Portland, spraying mace and pepper spray and shooting paintballs onto peaceably assembled demonstrators as lawful patriots, right? That this was their right, that this was something that they should have the right to do to defend themselves. Similarly, have they praised or refused to condemn other significant acts of political violence, either in the past or elsewhere in the world? And when it comes to Kyle Rittenhouse, Donald Trump has essentially assigned one of his lawyers to defend him, and has said again publicly and on Twitter that he believes Rittenhouse was justified in killing the protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I find this to be chilling. I find this to be deeply disturbing. I really did not think that there would be a moment in political history in my lifetime when an American president would essentially sanction or excuse the use of lethal violence against unarmed opponents by his supporters. This is the moment we are at right now. I will point out to you that in a recent interview in The New Yorker, Stephen Levitsky was quoted as saying the following. He compares what Trump was doing in 2016 at the micro level in his rallies with what he's now doing at the macro level as the inhabitant of the White House, with all the amplification that comes with the bully pulpit that the occupant of the White House gets. Quote, "We now have the potential in towns and cities across the country for pretty significant violence, with a large number of deaths. Trump is either unaware of this or doesn't care. I don't normally like to make these comparisons, But this sort of encouragement of violence for political purposes is worryingly similar to what the fascist movement did in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. And it's worthwhile noting that there is, I think, a fairly precise historical parallel here between, for instance, Mussolini's deliberate instigation of violence in order to destabilize society, in order to then be able to bring strongman tactics to bear to address the problem of destabilization, to create instability in order to further one's own political gains. There's a striking parallel between that and what's happening in the United States today. So I now want to go further. And what Levitsky and Zablat do in How Democracies Die is look at leaders. And I certainly believe that we should be focusing on Donald Trump in this moment and attempting to hold him to higher standards than he currently meets. But having said that, I think we also need to ask, 3.5 years into Trump's presidency, almost 4 years into his presidency, how widespread is the erosion of democratic norms, and how widespread is the support for violent alternatives to democracy? Has Trump succeeded in encouraging a more broad-based support for violence when democracy does not do what it is you want it to do? And I'm going to start with this book, a few diagrams from this book from Yascha Mounk, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And Mounk's overall thesis is that there was a high watermark of support for liberal democracy in the Western world in the post-war periods, in part because liberal democracy seemed to deliver the goods, to create a high standard of living in that period. And that as the economy has been transformed, as people have seen their standard of living decline, their economic precariousness increase, inequality come back with a vengeance, their support for democracy has proved to be fickle or unstable, that they were happy to support it so long as it gave them a high standard of living and increased economic opportunity and mobility. But once that no longer applied, they have started to withdraw support for democracy. So support for democracy was instrumental and not intrinsic. It's not that we were all convinced that democracy is in and of itself valuable so much as that we valued it so long as it delivered prosperity. Once it stopped, we stopped supporting it. And so, as you can see, when you look at this by age, right, people born in the 1930s, 71% of them, a strong majority, indicate that it's important to them or essential to live in a democracy, right? And that goes down by the decade of birth to the point where you get to people born in the 1980s, people who are in their 30s mainly today, who less than a third of them say that's important to them to live in a democracy. And of course, these are people who have not experienced any of the post-war prosperity in their lifetimes, and whose main experience of democracy may be with a system that they consider to be basically unresponsive to their needs and their interests. So another way of looking at this is just in terms of interest in politics. And again, what we see is declining by the decade of birth. That would seem to be a basic prerequisite for democracy functioning well. And one last metric of this is the support for non-democratic rule. And what you can see is that if you were 18 to 24 in the 1990s, you had very little support for the idea of military rule in the United States. And that was very similar to everyone else in your society. But by the time we get into the last decade, almost a quarter of people 18 to 24 years old support the possibility of military rule in this country, and that's substantially higher than people of all ages. So again, some evidence, general evidence of widespread eroding support for democracy in the United States today. But what I want to focus on in particular is what's happening with Republicans. And in particular, the Republican Party is basically a white party today. So we're also talking about white Americans. And the article that I'm drawing on is a very recently published article by Larry Bartels, very influential contemporary political scientist. And the article is called "Ethnic Antagonism Erodes Republican Commitment to Democracy." And I just want you to look at the survey he did in January of 2020. Over 1,000 Republican or Republican-leaning individuals were asked to give their opinion on these statements. The traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 24% strongly agree with that statement. 26%, almost 27% agree, so that more than 50% of Republicans agree with the idea that we may have to use force to preserve the traditional American way of life. And please note that only 6.5% of the Republicans that were surveyed by Bartels strongly disagree with that statement. We're going to see a similar pattern as we go through these other questions. A time will come when patriotic Americans have to take the law into their own hands. You get upwards of 40% of the survey respondents agreeing with that statement, and only 8.5% strongly disagreeing. Strong leaders sometimes have to bend the rules in order to get things done. Again, almost 50% agree with that statement, whereas only 6.1% disagree with that statement. It's hard to trust the results of elections when so many people will vote for anyone who offers a handout. And here you get over 70, essentially 75% of Republicans agreeing with the idea that the basic mechanism via which democracy operates, elections, are not to be trusted, and less than 3% strongly disagreeing with this. I find this to be deeply disturbing. It indicates that a political party, the Republican Party, that has in many respects waged an attack on democracy, disavowed support for core democratic norms, has either remade its rank and file to also be democracy skeptics, or else it is simply going where its constituents want it to go rather than pushing back, trying to educate them, trying to counter democratic trends within its own constituencies. All right, so now how do we explain what I've just documented, the erosion of support for democracy among Republican rank and file? And here I want to say that I find Bartels' analysis to be extremely persuasive. It's very sophisticated in the kinds of mathematical regressions he runs on the data. One of the things he tries to do is to eliminate some of what we might call the usual suspects. So he looks at education level and finds very little correlation, right? on these ideas that it's hard to trust elections, that we have to use force to save the American way of life, that strong leaders bend the rules, and that we may have to take law into our own hands, very little correlation with education level. Very little correlation with the amount of political interest, right? The old theory was that it might be that rural Americans who don't really follow politics and who are uneducated, don't have much of a commitment to the system, but better educated, more interested urban Americans don't fit that mold. But this is not what we're seeing in this data. Again, if you look at the locale, whether they're in the big cities or the small town or a rural area, seems to have very little bearing on Republican attitudes on this these series of questions. So what is it that is driving these ideas? And here Bartels points to ethnic antagonism. And he uses sophisticated questions to try to figure out whether or not his respondents have hostile attitudes to African Americans, to Latino or Latinx Americans, to immigrants. And then he scales them according to that scale, right? How much ethnic antagonism do they show? If they show very low ethnic antagonism, they're on this end of the scale. If they show very high ethnic antagonism, they're on this end of the scale. He makes a prediction, and then he judges his actual results against the prediction. And what you can see is that he predicted that ethnic antagonism would drive distrust in elections, the willingness to use force to save the traditional American way of life, a need for strong leaders who bend the rules, a willingness to take the law into your own hands. And basically his predictions were very much borne out by these results. It's not a perfect fit, but it certainly is a very close match, right? And so as you can see, among the actual respondents, those who don't show much ethnic antagonism are not inclined to mistrust elections, are not inclined to use force or to want strong leaders to bend the rules or to take law into their own hands. But as you move up into people who show more and more antagonism to ethnic minorities, these are almost all white people, right? You see more and more of the erosion of democratic norms, the willingness to use violence, force, take the law into your own hands, distrust elections. And so this then is the backdrop to what's happening in the United States today. And of course, it occurs in the midst of a national election and a national reckoning on issues of racial justice, with protesters in the streets in many communities in America on a fairly regular basis. This is what has Levitsky worrying about the potential for violence. And of course, we have very lax gun control laws, or in some states, really no gun control laws. And we have an increasingly active so-called militia movement with Americans with guns organizing politically in order to further their causes. And so that's the backdrop for these kinds of findings. Now, I don't just want to stop here. I want to do my best to explain what's going on. Before I do that, I do want to summarize Bartels' findings by letting him speak in his own words. This is from his significance section of the article. By the way, the article, it's a little technical, but it's only 8 pages long. It's published online. It's in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is the summary of the significance. Growing partisan polarization and democratic backsliding in various parts of the world have raised concerns about the attachment of ordinary Americans to democratic institutions and procedures. I find that substantial numbers of Republicans endorse statements contemplating violations of key democratic norms, including respect for law and for the outcomes of elections and eschewing the use of force in pursuit of political ends. The strongest predictor by far of these anti-democratic attitudes is ethnic antagonism, especially concerns about the political power and claims on government resources of immigrants, African Americans, and Latinos. The strong tendency of ethnocentric Republicans to countenance violence and lawlessness, even prospectively and hypothetically, underlines the significance of ethnic conflict in contemporary US politics. So, with that in place, I now want to ask, what is happening in the Republican Party? What is happening not with Donald Trump, but with ordinary Republicans, and especially with the subset of Republicans who are white and feel ethnic antagonism. Please note, right, that some of his respondents scored very low on the ethnic antagonism scale, but a large portion of them scored very high. I'll get into that a little bit later. By the way, if you were to compare Democrats, that basically 90% of Democrats score low enough on the ethnic antagonism scale that they would be in the bottom 10% of Republicans. I do want to be careful here and note that Democrats also have shown an erosion of democratic norms, perhaps not the same readiness to endorse violence or lawlessness. But there's a pretty good finding that when Barack Obama was president and the Republicans were in control of Congress, that Democrats preferred Obama to work around Congress rather than working through Congress, which again is an erosion of democratic norms. There's some of this for both sides. But let's go back to the white Republicans. And I just want to point out to you, just as I could put all my books about the erosion of support of democracy in America, there's a whole bookshelf full of books about what's happening to white Americans, especially working class white Americans who do not live in the major urban centers, especially on the coasts of the country. We've talked about some of these books together before. Deaths of Despair by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. I'll go a little bit into this just to refresh your memory in a moment, but the idea that there are large numbers of deaths occurring among white working class Americans from drug overdose, from alcoholism, from suicide, and this is indicative of their despair about their prospects in this country. This is a wonderful book by Catherine Kramer, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker. And Jennifer Silva's recent book, I think, very nicely complements what Kramer finds. The title of Silva's book, which is a more kind of an anthropology of rural America, is We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America, right? And so the sense that rural Wisconsin is completely ignored by politicians elected from the population centers in the south of the state, and that as a result, their interests do not figure in the political calculus and the way in which policy is devised, that although there may be real problems of urban poverty in places like Milwaukee, there are also problems to do with rural poverty, and the politicians are sensitive to the former and completely ignorant and indifferent to the latter, right? And so there's this sense that we're still here, but nobody notices us, nobody pays any attention to us, and that this is deeply resented. Similarly, Arlie Russell Hochschild's book, well-known anthropologist and sociologist from UC Berkeley, now in retirement, Strangers in Their Own Land. anger and mourning on the American right. Another effort to show ethnographically, if you go to the places where the jobs have gone away and interview the people who live there, they are hurt. They are suffering. They are also resentful. And so Carol Anderson, White Rage, is another account of the hurt, the anger, the anxiety. And so I, in the title to this slide, speak of downward mobility, precariousness, loss of status, dislocation, and invisibility. You may have seen some of the recent reporting on what's happening in food banks in the United States, right? The idea that more and more people are forced to choose between paying rent and eating. Of course, the pandemic and its economic consequences are worsening a trend that has been going on for a long time of the erosion of the livelihood, of the decent paying jobs, of what Case and Deaton called the very pillar of the existence of white working class America, the integration into the economy and the society via paid labor. When that disappears, your very sense of social standing and belonging is eroded. And I speak then of populist alchemy. And what I mean here is the idea that a populist leader like Donald Trump transforms anxiety about one's status, one's standing, one's precariousness, one's capacity to pay all one's bills, the prospects for one's children's future, right? It's not easy to be constantly insecure about those basic human goods. And if you can transform that anxiety into anger and blame others for that, you may remove some of that deep cognitive dissonance, some of that precarious psychological despair that is leading, in some cases, to suicide, in many cases to drug or alcohol abuse, that's generating anxiety that is increasing heart disease, right? This is not easy to bear. And in a sense, the kind of populist politics that Donald Trump supports gives an out. And so I do think it's essential to understand where this is coming from, not just to condemn it. That's easy, right? It's obviously beyond lamentable that this is occurring in our politics, that violence is spewing forth, that it seems to be motivated by racial antagonism, but also understanding why in the third decade of the 21st century we're experiencing this requires a moment of some empathy, some sympathy, some effort to discover where the people who are roiling our politics and voting for a politician who has so badly mismanaged the coronavirus that more people are dying in the United States by the hour than have died in New Zealand for the entire period of the pandemic, right? It's just colossally, I'm at a loss for words, the total incompetence, and yet a substantial portion of the American population is supporting him. And apparently supporting him even though his electoral prospects are quite bleak, supporting him even though, as a result, he is willing to foment political violence if he believes it will increase his likelihood of success. So where is this coming from? And I want to talk about two main sources of anxiety before kind of pulling out and being more general. One of them is racial. And again, we've looked at some of this data before. In 2015, right? There were more people who are not white than who are white born in the United States. That's actually been true since 2013, if you want to talk about a demographic inflection point. And obviously, this means by the time we get to 2031, there will be, that's not that long from now, it's a decade from now, right? There will be more non-white citizens coming of age than white citizens coming of age. If you look at the foreign-born percentage of the population, it is at a near all-time high, or at least on its way there, right? We're looking at rates of immigration that are comparable to the highest periods in American history. This is rapidly transforming the United States. If we look at what's happening with births and deaths, right? Whites are actually dying more than at their so-called replacement rate, right? More than they're being born at their replacement rate. And so in all of these respects, you can begin to understand why whites might feel that they are losing their hold on power within the society, that this is a frightening prospect for them. And so again, this stuff is guesswork. That's putting it too strongly. This stuff cannot be predicted precisely, but it is clear that we are on our way to a so-called majority-minority society, a society in which there is not a single racial majority and which whites become the minority of the population. Whether that will happen in 2045 or 2055 or 2065 is unclear, but that it is happening is clear. And this is by itself prompting a great deal of anxiety among at least a certain kind of white Americans who live in dominantly white communities and who feel neglected by the political process, in part because they feel that political elites pay more attention to racial minorities than they pay to white Americans. This then is one of the background things to be looking at when we look at the deaths of despair, the phenomenon that Deaton and Case call our attention to. And as we can see, there's been a steady decline in the mortality rate in most developed countries going into the present. But in the United States, beginning around 2000, that decline really slowed. And essentially, by the time we get into the last decade, we're in a very stable period. I know this data doesn't come quite up to the present. I would suspect that things have actually gotten worse during the pandemic. And what we see is that what is driving this is the less educated committing suicide, overdosing on drugs, succumbing to alcohol-related diseases, and that this is particularly pronounced among white Americans without a college degree. And that it basically is barely affecting white Americans with a college degree, not affecting Black Americans with a college degree at all. The racial dimension is especially clear when we compare African Americans and white Americans across the board. And what we can see is that African Americans look like Australians or New Zealanders, right? That their mortality continues to go down throughout the 21st century. Whereas when we separate out white Americans, their mortality actually went up in the 21st century, primarily driven by people 40 to 60 years old succumbing to those deaths of despair. So again, this does not mean we have to be sympathetic with the expression of despair in terms of racial resentment. but there is something that's driving it. This is not pure hateful racism. This is about what structural changes in the economy are doing to working class people who had up until 20, 30 years ago expected that they would have ongoing economic mobility. When we pan out and look at this from the largest perspective, right? Look at the distribution of income over time. What we can see is that the American economy is profoundly unfair, that over the last 40 years, the top income group has seen a 400% cumulative increase in its income. The bottom 50% has barely seen any rise at all, and obviously a vast increase in the inequality. The same is true of the middle 40%. It's only when you get up to the top 90% that income growth keeps pace with GDP growth. Everybody else is seeing less of a share of the wealth created in our society. The top 1% and the top 0.01% are getting the lion's share of the wealth created in our economy. One way to look at this is to look at the labor share, right? How much of the wealth created in our society is taken as income by workers? And what you see is that throughout the last 30 years, that share has been declining, and it's far down from where it was in the post-war years. Again, another indication of the unfairness of the American economy that is driving this resentment. And so I want to conclude by noting that it's not just loss of work, loss of income, loss of wealth, loss of economic standing, or loss of racial dominance, demographically speaking, that is driving white Americans into the arms of a party that has increasingly little support for democracy unless it can win via democratic channels. It's more than that that's at stake. We're in a period of rapid cultural change, driven in part by rapid and disruptive technological change. We're seeing the decline in many sectors of our society of traditional religiosity. We're seeing the decline of traditional sexual roles and sexual norms of the family in its traditional form. More and more children are born out of wedlock. More and more people have children without getting married, even if they're going to be permanently coupled. More women decide to have children, even if they have no desire to be married. Obviously, the Supreme Court has made homosexual marriage the law of the land, and more people are openly homosexual. There's more and more interracial relationships. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I myself am one to celebrate the growth in freedom, liberty, diversity that accompanies this cultural change. But for many people, the rate of cultural change is frightening. It feels as if the center doesn't hold, as if our society is disintegrating around them, right? You combine this with rapid and dislocating economic change, rapid and disruptive technological change, and you've got a deep sense of what Emile Durkheim called anomie, right? The absence of normative regulation of life, the absence of shared values, the absence of economic protection, the collapse of that pillar of social integration. And at the same time that all of a sudden everybody's commenting and talking on social media and communicating via Zoom, right? I've already spoken about the rapid demographic changes we're undergoing. We've seen a decline in unions, a decline in the local level of politics and the participation in clubs and civil society organizations that gave many people a sense of belonging and empowerment. And we have a strong sense that our democratic institutions are run by elites who do not resemble the average person in our society and do not respond to their needs, right? That's the "we're still here," the politics of resentment, the anger that many people feel, right? And you bring all of these things together, and it is, in a sense, understandable that people are wondering whether democracy still serves their interests. And you then have a leader channeling them into forms of violent politics. And it is perhaps unsurprising that we find the support for democracy eroding and the willingness to participate in violence increasing. Now, I want to say one more thing today, and then I'll open things up for discussion. And this concerns what I consider to be perhaps the saddest irony of the current moment. And that is that all of this occurs precisely at a moment when many white Americans are willing to reckon with the fact that US history is shot through with racial injustice, and to try to see what we can do in this historical moment to address that, right? And so I want to note two things, and I've got two diagrams for you to show this. One of them is, I think, a positive development, and this is looking at the fact that Trump may lose support from voters with low levels of prejudice. And what you can see here, if you look at this diagram, is that as prejudice goes up, so does support for Republican candidates. That this was not as true in 2012 as it was in 2016. And that's in part because Trump mobilized and legitimized that form of politics of racial resentment. And what we see when we look at this in 2020 is that, in fact, there's not as much racial resentment in our politics, and it's not driving support for Trump in the way that it did in 2016. And so if we're to pick a particular category, thinking about white suburban women, the women that Trump seems to have in mind when he is fomenting violence and indicating that the unrest occurring in urban America will be fanning out into the suburbs at any moment. That kind of politics is not seeming to work to actually motivate those voters in the same way or to the same degree that it did in 2016. That's encouraging. But what I find to be a little distressing is these kinds of gaps in which you see when it comes for support for reparations among Democratic voters, 81% of Blacks favor them, less than a third of whites favor them, right? And when it comes for to progressive politics, there's more alignment between Blacks and whites as long as it's not racially specific. But to pull out from some of the polling data and to synthesize, we are at a moment, I think the first moment since the mid-1960s where there seems to be an opportunity in American society to really speak to the politics of racial inequality, to the history of racism in our society. And as opposed to taking advantage of that opportunity, Donald Trump is running a political campaign that encourages his supporters to fear the politics of racial justice. That's where I will pick up with you next week, but I did want to really focus our attention on some of the distressing developments in democratic politics that we've seen this week. I will stop there and take your questions. As you know, I'm going to unmute everybody. Please be aware that there will be some background noise.
David?
Yes, who is this?
Wilma Rader.
Hi, Wilma. Nice to see you.
All of the adjectives you use to just define how whites are feeling: hurt, anger, anxiety, precariousness, loss of status, dislocation, invisibility, that totally applies to the African American community. And there's a collision now, because some people see their interest in reform and others now in cataclysmic anti-democratic societies. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it certainly occurred to me that it was ironic to use the term invisible, right? Which of course, many of us, when we think of that, think of Ralph Ellison and Invisible Man, right? The idea behind some of these books, you know, We're Still Here, the Strangers in Their Own Land, is that white Americans have come to feel that they too are no longer seen by political elites, by the people who support Democrats, by white urban people, by African Americans and Latinos and immigrants, et cetera, right? And so, yes, and there is a peculiar irony here, which is that white Americans, in a sense, are experiencing what Alexis once referred to as declining expectations, right? Yeah. They had experienced profound income and wealth growth in the middle of the 20th century through the waning decades of the 20th century, and they expected that to continue into the 21st century, right? And lo and behold, in the 21st century, the rug was pulled out from under their feet. They find themselves in a position of economic precariousness. Not only that, but many white Americans told themselves a story, according to which part of the reason they did so well in the middle of the 20th century is because they worked hard, and as a result, they were more deserving of the wealth and benefits that they got than were African Americans and other people who relied on welfare. And this has led, I believe, to many white Americans blaming themselves, not making alliance with African Americans, Latino Americans, others who would be their natural allies. There's a long history of this in the labor movement, of divide and conquer, et cetera, right? And so, yes, of course, the adjectives that I use to apply to and explain the resentment of white working class Americans apply every bit as much to African Americans, given their history in this country. But African Americans did not expect that things would get better for them to the same degree that white Americans do. And so they are not experiencing deaths of despair to the same degree as white Americans are. And they're not drawn to the politics of rage and resentment to the same degree. I think one of the things that's so inspiring about the current Black Lives Matter protests is the fact that they are so peaceful, right? That's not uniformly true, but that's dominantly true, that they are so inspirational in their call for the country to live up to its ideals, that they don't represent a rejection of democracy so much as fidelity to democratic aspirations. And I think, you know, with the right leadership, there's tremendous opportunity here. Part of the reason that I'm going to concentrate over the next few weeks on a lecture series on racial justice in 21st century America is because it seems to me this is a real opportunity for our society, perhaps a once in a generation opportunity to undo some of the grave injustice, or at least repair some of the grave injustice of our society. And so this involves then having enough of an understanding of where white Americans are coming from to be able to try to persuade them that they should, as opposed to fearing and resenting the politics of racial justice, see it as an opportunity for them as well. Thank you for the good question, Wilma. I hope that, I know I just threw a ton at you. You obviously hit something I've been thinking about. Anyone else with the question at this point? I'll try not to give you an encyclopedic answer. I see John has his hand raised. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask about the implications of all this for electoral strategy over the next 7 weeks. Trump apparently has been reading Bartels. Trump has realized that violence is a pretty good issue, but race is better. And this morning, apparently, he just said that diversity education is un-American and maybe unconstitutional, and the federal government is going to defund diversity education, and any notion that there's systematic racism in the US is ridiculous. So,
Un-American.
Un-American and ridiculous. And yeah, and so that's clearly the direction the campaign's going to go in for the next 2 months. So how do the Democrats counter this? You very inspiringly said that, boy, if we can really bring the ideals of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been so impressive, if we can sort of make that more general and have people live up to these ideals, do you think that's a good platform for the Democrats to argue on? Should they be out making speeches about that or not? How should they handle this situation that they're in? How do they counter this strategy on the part of the Republicans?
So I'm going to start by just saying one thing, John, which is you said it's clear that this is what Trump's going to concentrate on for the next 2 months. I'm not nearly so clear about that. And the idea that he's going to be consistent in messaging certainly belies past experience, right? He has a hard time staying on message, and he clearly is flailing. He clearly is looking for anything that sticks right now. And I just want to show you something. I wasn't going to go into the horse race aspect of our current politics, but let me show you for a moment that so far, nothing that Trump has done seems to be working. And so this is a day ago using this 538 model, which is mainly based on state level polling. And I want you to see, not only has Biden's chance of winning the election increased over the last couple of weeks, so there's been no bounce from the convention for Trump. It's increased because it appears that his prospects at the state level are going up, right? North Carolina now joins Florida, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin as the states that are trending in the Democratic direction. I want to be clear. There's absolutely no guarantee, obviously 2 months out from the election, that this will continue. But I think part of what we're seeing from Trump is desperation over the fact that none of the attack lines that he's tried on Biden have succeeded. And so he's going to continue to rile up his base using violence, the threat of chaos, race, and resentment to do it, right? But this is the dilemma that Donald Trump faces, which is precisely those ploys to motivate his base seem to alienate the middle of the political spectrum.
David,
Go ahead. Yeah.
my question was about democratic strategy. What should the democratic strategy be?
And so in a sense, my answer is more of the same, right? Joe Biden should continue to say, that the Black Lives Matters protesters have right on their side, that they are perfectly within their liberty and their rights as citizens to continue to engage in peaceful protests, that looting and rioting are not forms of peaceful protests and that they should be punished with the full power of the law, to resist the effort to paint him as too far left, but to not take the bait of trying to outlaw and order Donald Trump, right? He seems, and in a sense, at the same time that I'm worried about where the rank and file Republican voter is going, I'm encouraged in a sense by the apparent collective wisdom of the Democratic electorate, because they chose the candidate who is least susceptible to this line of attack, right? They chose a mid-70s old white man who has been a political moderate his whole life, and so just can't be tarred this way. I think the more interesting question to my mind is not what the Democrats should be doing over the next couple months. And by the way, I didn't show it to you. I can show it to you for a moment. Again, this is not predictive and this is all very close, but what's happening with the Senate looks good for the Democrats also, right? So if the election were held today and the polls were right, trying to get you to be able to see all the numbers, the Democrats would probably win a narrow majority in the Senate. Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, and Maine are all very close. But it does appear, based on the best polling right now, that the Democrats are in pretty good shape. This is part of what's driving Republican desperation. I think one of, to my mind, the real mysteries here is why aren't more Republican senators or state elected officials condemning what Trump is doing? And I think that map helps you to see why. The Republicans are all in with Donald Trump, and they may be losing as a result. So John, let me circle back and say that to my mind, the more interesting question is if the Democrats win, if Joe Biden wins, if they win the Senate and retain control of the House, what should they do, right? How can they overcome the impasse in American politics to start passing policies that show white working class Americans in the Midwest, in rural areas, that it's possible to both be in favor of the politics of racial justice and do things that help working class Americans. Please note, all of that occurs in a context where we now have the largest debt relative to GDP since World War II, right? And so once again, the Democrats, if they win, will inherit something of a mess. Yeah. So somebody's saying they have to leave in a few minutes. I think that's Elizabeth. So let's take maybe one more question today.
What about
Bonnie, go ahead.
Okay. What about the issue of global warming? Isn't that something that concerns everyone? And if we were to deal with it in the way we should, it would make a lot of jobs.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Bonnie, and I will talk more about this in the upcoming lecture series. Unfortunately, global warming, like so much in American politics, has become a wedge issue. It's become part of the cultural wars. culture wars. And so